We're going to turn now to an important discussion that took place in the later part of Augustine's life. This conversation had really significant implications for the course of Western theology. Again, by that I mean theology in the part of the church that spoke Latin. So remember, there's those two sides of the Roman Empire, Eastern, Western. We're talking here about the Western church, not the Greek-speaking East. And this has to do with Augustine's understanding of original sin. So here's where we're headed. Just keep this in mind as I go through this history. Augustine's theology altered the conversation in Western theology in two really important ways. First, understanding original sin as original guilt, and bringing in the idea of predestination as God choosing who would receive grace. Those two ideas went together, and they were really fairly new. There had been, different people who might have talked about little bits and pieces, but Augustine works these out, and then they get disseminated owing to Augustine's importance in theology. For those of you who are saying, well, we've talked about sin before, right? This is something new. Yeah, this is. I've mentioned a few times that thinkers like Athanasius talk about the problems of sin and we're born into a situation of sin, but have also pointed out that people like Athanasius didn't talk about being born guilty. We're now getting into a conversation where someone is going to say that people are born guilty before they even have a chance to sin. Here's what happened. We need to start with a man named Pelagius, from whom we get a heresy called Pelagianism. Now, Pelagianism, as you may figure out, is really the great American heresy. Pelagianism, if you're looking for a short way of thinking about it, could be the Nike model. Just do it. Here's what I mean. Pelagius was a monk. He was an ascetic, someone who spent a lot of time trying to do the right thing. And he reacted to a line from the Confessions, a line you didn't read because it's in Book 10, where Augustine says, "Grant what thou command, and command what thou wilt." In other words, God, if you make me do what you command, then you can command me to do anything. What Pelagius heard in that was Augustine saying, we can't on our own follow God. Basically, God has to do it in us. And Pelagius thought that was bad theology, and particularly bad pastoral theology, meaning he thought it was a bad thing to tell people because then they might stop trying, and Pelagius didn't want people to stop trying. Pelagius developed his own ideas about human sin and human free will, our capacity to act as we want to act. And here's what he and then his followers said. Adam did bring sin into the world. He's not denying that. And then other people copy Adam. We all do what Adam did, but we do it freely. Sin, for Pelagius, was freely chosen acts. This isn't the bondage of the will that Augustine talks about. It's a decision to do bad things. Now, Pelagius will acknowledge that because of sin in your environment, it makes it more likely you'll sin. But for him, ultimately, you really do have a choice. You really could not sin. You really could choose not to copy Adam. We have a conscience that tells us what to do and what not to do, and that's a gift from God. So, according to one theologian, for Pelagius and his followers, grace is really divine assistance. But basically the assistance is this. God has told us what God wants. He's given us laws, he's given us commandments. And then he gave us Jesus, who did what God wanted. And now, well, we should do it. I mean, Pelagius is like, what more do you need? God told you what God wanted. God gave you an example of what God wanted. Now go do it. Parenthetical note, there are some modern theologians who are making a connection between Pelagianism, what we're talking about here, and Nestorianism. Do you remember way back? Hold on. We needed a pencil sharpener. We now have a pencil sharpener, so we're going back to the connection between Pelagianism and Nestorianism. What these theologians posit is this, that Nestorianism, that idea that Jesus is God nature, divine nature, and human nature in a voluntary relationship, is a very Pelagian Christology, meaning you basically have a human being who is really, really good and decides to unite with God and does it so voluntarily. That's a really, they would say, optimistic view of what human nature is capable of. So these theologians suggest that part of what was going on with both Pelagianism and Nestorianism is a really, they would say, too high evaluation of what human beings are capable of without being completely animated by the divine. Parenthetical. I think it's interesting, but then again, I watch Watergate documentaries for fun. Suffice to say, Augustine did not like Pelagianism. He had most of his battle not with Pelagius, but with one of Pelagius's disciples, a man by the name of Julian, who, again, maybe parenthetically, was younger than Augustine, but was part of a family that Augustine knew fairly well. So this was a pretty significant battle for Augustine. And like a lot of battles where you have people kind of become entrenched in sides, what you get out of this battle is Augustine at his kind of most extreme position on sin and grace. So here's what Augustine says. Adam, and we would say Eve, but he just said Adam, so I'm going to go with that, were able not to sin as they were created. That was a capability they had. But once Adam and Eve sinned, everyone else is in a different position. We are not able not to sin. I know that's a double negative, but that's what Augustine said, so we're going to go with it. So, as created, able not to sin. As fallen, not able not to sin. Here's where the guilt part comes in. According to Augustine, all humanity sinned in a lump, or sinned in Adam. Here's why he said that. He was working with a Latin translation of the Bible. Remember, the New Testament was originally written in Greek. And what his Latin translation of Romans 5:12 said was this: By one man sin entered the world, and death by sin. So death passed upon all men, for in him all men sinned. So it makes it sound like in Adam we were somehow all there and all sinned in Adam. Now, just for a point of comparison, the New Revised Standard Version, one of the major versions of the Bible used today, translates it this way. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and so death spread to all because all have sinned. That's pretty different. Sin coming into the world through Adam, but then all having sinned. I think it's at least worth noting here that the Greek side of the Christian world did not accept Augustine's understanding of sin going forward, what we're going to talk about as original guilt. And a lot of people would argue that's because they were working off the original Greek, which didn't actually say what the Latin translation said. Augustine, for all the things that he was not a Greek scholar, so he was working with the text that he had, but many people now would say it was not a great text. So he thinks that in Adam everyone sinned, meaning that we don't just share the effects of sin, Athanasius would say that, but that we share the guilt of sin. We are born guilty before God. So in the Western world, original sin takes on another meaning, that you have original guilt. Then Augustine goes even further. He'll say that even after baptism, even after the guilt of original sin has been wiped away, we have concupiscence, which is kind of a fun word, or a desire for that which is opposed to God, or self-centered desire. And importantly for Augustine, sex is impossible without concupiscence. It was possible prior to the fall, but after the fall, no. In any sexual act, there is concupiscence. And because there's desire in any sexual act, and we're all produced out of a sexual act, there's a real way in which sin is transmitted through sex. Again, many modern theologians would say this is not Augustine at his most attractive, but it's what he understood to be true. So, we are all now in a situation in which we're born guilty and we don't have the option of not sinning. We're really, really stuck. Here, I want to be careful with what Augustine is and is not saying. Augustine's not saying that we can't choose between options. So if you wake up in the morning and you look in the refrigerator and there are eggs and there's yogurt, you can make a choice between eggs and yogurt. What Augustine is saying is that you don't have the ability on your own to routinely choose the good. You will on your own routinely choose the bad. So you have choices that you can make, but not the choice for the good, big G, good. That then has ramifications for Augustine's understanding of grace. According to Augustine, only God's grace can make us free. We're bound in sin. We can't on our own choose the good or move towards the good. So, God must give us grace to make us free. And here, Augustine takes a really strong stance on what grace does. We're going to see that there are other ways of thinking about this, and I'll describe another one in a second. So here are Augustine's, then we'll hear another. For Augustine, God doesn't just give us the ability to choose the good, God operates in us the willing and doing. So grace really means that God comes in and goes, you're going to look at me. Now, you could compare that with, say, Athanasius, or someone we'll talk about later named John Wesley, who says, no, what grace does is that God makes God's self available and makes it possible for us to choose God. But then we really make a choice. Augustine ends up saying, we are so habituated away from God that in order for us to be brought back, God has to come in and go like that. God turns our heads for us. That then leads Augustine into a doctrine called predestination. Predestination, as it gets used in the Western part of the Christian church, is the belief that God decides who will be saved and who will not be saved, who will be saved and who will be damned. And you can see how Augustine is working out his logic here. We're born guilty, which means we're, damned, according to Augustine. We are unable to turn ourselves to the good. God has to come in and go like this. It's pretty clear to Augustine that God's not doing that for everybody, because just look around you. I mean, really. So that means God must be doing it for some people and for others. He also wants to say that the only way for grace to really be grace is if God does it. Now again, not everyone's going to have that kind of an understanding of grace, but it becomes the way that Augustine thinks about it, and then it becomes the model that pretty much everybody in the Western tradition has to interact with. I will say, and this is foreshadowing a little bit when this discussion changes, is that salvation for Augustine is still becoming like God. So he still has this view of salvation that says we're infused with charity. When we are saved, God really makes us different kinds of people. That will contrast with some of what we say later, where salvation can sound a little bit more like a decision of whether you're innocent or guilty. Augustine isn't really there yet, and if none of that made sense to you, just hold on and we'll get there. But again, this becoming is what God does in us, what God does for us, not kind of what God brings us to or allows us to do or helps us to do. Where this all gets really nasty, and I'm going to say I think it is kind of nasty, has to do with the baptism of infants. One of the major points of controversy between Julian and Augustine had to do with the status of infants who hadn't been baptized. Would they go to hell or heaven if they died? Well, The Creed says there's only one baptism for the remission of sins. Pelagius said infants are baptized for the reception of the Holy Spirit, but not for the remission of sins. They haven't sinned yet, according to Pelagius. But Augustine says, well, no, the Creed says there's only one baptism for the remission of sins. That whatever happens in baptism for infants happens for adults. It's got to be the same thing. So if baptism means the remission of sins for adults, it's got to mean that for babies, which means that babies somehow have to have sins that need to be remitted. Hence, babies who aren't baptized, well, the news is bad. Again, the logic here makes sense once you start operating in a certain sphere, but a lot of Christians would say that Augustine didn't need to start where he started. He was working with a bad translation.